This podcast is a continuation of our Global Contemporary Art chapter, and we're focusing primarily on women in art, either women as the artist or women as the subject of the art. Now, in class, one thing that we didn't talk about that I really wanted to is this term called critical theory. You should write that down, critical theory. Now, critical theory is a really complicated term, but I'm going to really simplify it here. Critical theory explores the underlying power structures that shape our world. So, who is in power? In what context? How does one get power? Um, and how does this affect the way that we live? Now, two important parts of this critical theory is race and feminism. So you have critical race theory that talks primarily about race or talks primarily about feminism. And it all follows this basic sort of economy of power. So within this economy, we all have a capital or value, cultural capital. And this cultural capital, you should write this down: economy of power, cultural capital. And then from cultural capital, what is that culture? So what is one's language, music, dress? And of course, like, this could be applied to both in the context of what we're talking about, race and feminism. How does a woman dress? How does a woman talk? What kind of music does a woman like? And in the same way, you could apply it to any race as well. Now, so you have this cultural capital, and the big question is, when you're really looking at this critical theory, is which currency, like think about capital as money, and then we talk about cultural capital, so all of this culture, which currency has more value? Which currency has more value? So think about this idea of exchange rates, right? So if you take your US dollar to, I don't know, say Poland, your dollar will get you more zlotys, right? So different exchanges. And embedded within this currency or this exchange are stereotypes, because we know not all women listen to the same music, or not all women like pink, but there is stereotypes within this, and that determines value as well. So, for instance, things that are sewn. So Faith Ringgold works with quilts. So it's sewn, and so people want to classify her work as craft. And it, say in the history of men working with art, what if men were all making quilt paintings instead of paintings? Would they have as much value as their paintings do today? So we're talking about what has value, and typically things that are done by people who have less power typically tend to have less value, determined by the power structure. And the power structure is determined by history, determined by economics, roles that people play, why they play them, or if they're forced to play them. It's very complicated, but we'll leave it at that. So critical theory. Okay, so we talked about Kiki Smith, and she is asking us to rethink the way that we direct our gaze, rethink the way that we think about women. And we were in class, we just started to talk about the artist Wangechi Mutu, and she is a artist who works primarily with collage, so collage and paints, and you see her working right there. Now, in her form, so she's working with the figure, so write that down. She's working with the figure, the female figure, and she's using mass-produced images to help her create this. So that's her inspiration. She's looking at, you should write this down, fashion magazines, National Geographic magazines, and also pornography. How are women portrayed? So let's look at this image again. We didn't quite get to really look at it in class. The figure actually has a sort of liquid quality. You can see how the paint moves about this piece. And it's also this bright red color. So let's look at the context. So she's in what appears to be like a forest. So we have these trees all around her, and she seems to be lying on a cloth. All right, so you can see this cloth. So it's sort of a made up land, and the cloth has significance. She's referencing what's called a kubu cloth, and this is a textile that is coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Let's look at some images of it. So she's referencing Africa here. So here are some of our images, and then let's go back and compare it to what we see in her work. So you can definitely see how she's influenced by that textile. So including that cloth, she's referencing place. So the place of this woman, she's lying on this cloth that comes from Africa. She is from Kenya. She was born in Kenya, and she works in New York. She received her BFA from the Cooper Union and her MFA from Yale University. So we have both of these cultures coming together: her African, and then also her, her being in the U.S. This hybridity of both cultures coming together is really important because she's analyzing how women are portrayed in American culture. Okay, so let's look at this pose here. So we have this naked woman, right? She's naked and she is in what we would call like a lady pose or a sexy pose. Her leg is crossed, her arm is behind her head, and she's looking at us in a suggestive way. This is referencing Pin-Up Girls. Let me make this bigger for you here. Or you see how her hand is behind her head, her leg is in the air. Pin-up girls are mass-produced images of women, really popular, mostly around, during the World War I and II. And so here are some images of pin-up girls. They're suggestive, they're kind of tacky, and women are seen as objects. These are made mostly just for men and men's enjoyment. So she's referencing that. She's also, you can see Picasso's Demoiselle de Navaillon hand behind the head as well. Um, and she's also referencing this idea of uh, violence as well. So you have this, the title, which is Praying Mantra, which is this insect that eats the male. So she's referencing that in the name. So we're talking about like the femme fatale, the half woman, half animal, and the way that we see that in our culture. As I said before, she's referencing fashion magazines, National Geographic, and pornography. Now let's think about who she is. She is a black woman from Africa who has been living in New York for a while. So she's really aware of the American sexualization of black women's bodies, and especially this idea of black women as being very hungry for sex, combining that with this sort of animalistic poses that you see sort of right here. Just look turn on the TV and watch some sort of music video, and you're going to get the idea of what she's talking here. She's looking particularly at contemporary pop culture, and you're going to see it all over the place. So how does this image speak to the violence of this insect, right? So she's combining the idea, and this is her work right here, women, violence, sexuality. She's putting this in our face, and this is one way a lot of contemporary artists come into sort of questioning the way we look, is they look at stereotypes and they throw them back in our face, and we're certainly seeing that here. Okay, I want us to look closer at the image here because she has something interesting in her hand, so make sure you're looking here. Can you see what she has that she's holding in her hand? It's green. Okay, right there, it's green, and she's holding it in her hand. What is that? Okay, it's this green thing. Well, this is a snake, and she is tying the idea of this hypersexualized female to a specific story. And that story is the story of Adam and Eve, where Eve offers Adam the apple, she tempts him, and Eve is dangerous, right? She could manipulate Adam into eating the apple into sense. So let's go back to this idea of the mantra. So it's a praying mantra is the title, and we're playing on the name of the praying mantis. A mantra is something that you say or you repeat over and over again. Given that she's using mass-produced images like magazines, looking at our culture and throwing our culture back at us, what do you think she's saying about some of our mantras, particularly the mantras that we have about women, and very specifically about Black female identity? What are some of the mantras that we talk about with female identities and these things that are repeated in our culture? Combining the African cloth with this sort of Americanized pin-up girl pose, she is complicating this Western and non-Western view of women and questioning how we see gender, sexuality, and cultural identity in the two of those combined. Academy tells us, and I'm reading directly from there, hybridity, so this concept often used in post-colonial studies, it describes the mixing of cultures of colonized and colonizer. It can produce a third space for newer and often disruptive understandings of cultural identity. So she's showing us this very disturbed, confusing cultural identity. All of her figures tend to have a sort of alien look to them. So as you can see right here. So what happens when cultural identities are confused and mixed together? Okay. Also on Khan Academy it says, despite this reference to a real praying mantis, Mutu's praying mantra is also vulnerable to our gaze, suggesting that the figure may be a victim that is preyed upon by mantras. So going back to this idea of repeated things within our society, Mutu creates a natural, even primitive, fictional environment that entices and disturbs us even as she invites us to explore stereotypes about the African female body as explicitly sexual, dangerous, and aesthetically deformed in relation to Western standards. Whew, this is a tough piece, I think. It is, she's really creating something that's very powerful here. One last thing and then we're going to move on. She's influenced by an artist named Hannah Hoke. You can see her name right there. She is what we call a Dada artist. She's coming from the Dada movement, which was working around World War I. They take images from popular culture and collage them together, oftentimes critiques of society, particularly war. She creates these photo montages, and a photo montage is basically where you take a photograph and you glue it together. So it's a collage with magazines. Okay, that's it for this podcast.